Hey, greetings everyone. It's GleeCon, and I am back again today, bringing you another episode of Lore of Warcraft. This one of the art book episodes. So on this show, we cover every little tiny piece of lore. Lately, it's mostly in-game, as we try to do every quest in the game, and unearth every little bit of lore and books and all that stuff that we can read. But there's tons of stuff, and we've read all of the books that lead up to Classic, all of the side lore, the chronicles that pertain to that. But there are a lot of non-canon stuff. We've covered a lot in previous episodes, publications, books, short stories, magazines. And I am on a journey right now, and it's much harder than any of the previous ones to uncover all of these collector's edition art books. But this episode continues our exploration of the World of Warcraft cinematic art of Wrath of the Lich King book. And we're going to keep on plugging away with these books as at least once per week to keep the OG fans like Cuzzy tuned in and happy. Plus, I really enjoyed them as well. So we're about halfway through this one, and we're just going to pick right up where we left off. This section's called The Curse of Ner'zhul. The Orc shaman Ner'zhul set in motion the events that led to the corruption of the Horde, yet ultimately Ner'zhul refused to give his people fully to the demonic ranks of the Burning Legion. As punishment for his defiance, the Demon Lord Kil'jaeden destroyed Ner'zhul's body, tortured his spirit, and offered Ner'zhul a final ultimatum: serve the Legion unconditionally, or suffer eternal agony. Ner'zhul pledged to obey Kil'jaeden and was reborn as a terrifying and vastly powerful agent of the Legion, the Lich King. Ner'zhul's spirit was magically shackled to a suit of armor and bound to the mighty runeblade Frostmourne. To ensure Ner'zhul's obedience, Kil'jaeden sealed the armor and blade within a block of ice collected from the far reaches of the Twisting Nether. That, I think, is new. I didn't realize that the ice itself came from the Twisting Nether. This frozen crystal was then cast into the world of Azeroth, settling in the snowy wastes of Northrend. Among the abilities bestowed upon the Lich King was lordship over death itself. From within his frozen throne, Ner'zhul summoned a number of undead to serve him, and tested his army against the Nerubians of Azul-Nerub and their mighty spider lord Anub'arak. Although the War of the Spider raged for years, many Nerubians who fell in battle, including Anub'arak himself, quickly became bound to the Lich King's iron will. The Lich King appeared to be faithfully serving his master, but he had in fact hatched a subversive plan. He created a small fissure in his prison, pushed Frostmourne through it, and directed his minions to carry the runeblade away from the frozen throne. Ner'zhul intended to use the sword as bait for a mighty champion who would free him and serve as a vessel for his restless spirit. While Frostmourne was positioned to serve its future purpose, the Lich King dutifully proceeded with his demon master's true agenda. The Lich King had formulated an insidious plague of undeath meant to annihilate humanity and create an army of faithful to the Burning Legion. To expedite the spread of this contagion, the Lich King recruited a powerful ally in the ambitious mage Kel'Thuzad, a senior member of Dalaran's ruling council. Under the Lich King's watchful gaze, Kel'Thuzad created the Cult of the Damned, a group of humans to whom he promised social equality and eternal life on Azeroth. The cultists spread the plague throughout Lordaeron's northern villages, amassing a host of mindless undead. Kel'Thuzad looked upon the growing army and named it the Scourge, for at the Lich King's whim it would surely scour humanity from the face of the world. And there's a picture of said Scourge, and this is also basically an image of what we see in the movie. Also, gotta say, Game of Thrones stole that. So here are different, this is on this page, Scourge variations, and opposite was the preliminary studies for the final concept, the Lich King leading the Scourge. So here we have just different casters. Yeah, just all kinds. They look very similar to the Forsaken, with some having mohawks. These have sort of glaives, little old school, like Renaissance style helmets, some almost padded or studded leather with spikes on this one. The weird Hellraiser style helmets on this. But if you look like with greaves, without greaves, this is a Scourge with his little weird hood. Yeah, so just all kinds of different variations. And here we have more sketches of him lifting Frostmourne to lead the charges, sketches of dragons, which would be in the air, the Scourge kind of moving forward, almost in a silhouette form. On these pages, you see Scourge silhouettes, specifically, as they crawl out of the ground, almost like an assassin jumping with a blade on the arm. Frost Giant Scourge, it looks like, maybe. Here you have like an Abomination-style Scourge. That's pretty cool. This one, I like how it shows them like pucked with swords and arrows. This one has like a weird flail attached to an arm and a peg leg. This guy's holding his head. This one's, an Abomination, but like with hands, almost like a spider with feet. I don't think one exists like that, but that's pretty cool. Here you have Scourge Brainstorming. So again, dual-wielding Scourge with a PlayStation sword. A spear with a sword on his back through him. Hard to say, dragging a ball and chain. More of these variations. These are the Caster Scourge, or maybe they are the Cult of the Damned type, but they look kind of undead. This one's lifting his head up, almost goblin-like, like a green goblin, like he's dancing or going to do a Hadouken or something. Here's you can see the frost kind of powering it, fueling it. Scourge Warrior concept and Scourge Undead Hero B variation. So these are Scourge Heroes. You can kind of see this one's a little more shaded, but other than that, very, very similar in their variants. Scourge Sketches. So here we have some of those with a big hammer. I like the kind of double-sided hammer. Almost like a Wraith from Warcraft 3, or whatever they are, but with armor and stuff on. Again, dual-wielding. Scourge Undead Hero A is below, no arms. More Scourge silhouettes. I like it that it's pulling its own sword out from inside itself. This is more like a Frankenstein zombie, axe in the head, helmet above it. Scourge Undead Hero A face studies, with and without the helmet and without the glowing eyes. Scourge Undead Hero A and Scourge Undead Hero B were used in the foreground of all shots depicting the Scourge and provided the basis for the design of the rest of the Undead army. Final color concepts for Scourge Hero A and Scourge Hero B appear coming up like at around 8 or so pages. This guy, we've seen pictures of him in this book before. I like how he's like dual wielding these hammers that are made of chunks of ice. Early Vrykul Scourge concepts. Before the game design team had a chance to design the Vrykul, Blizzard film department drafted some initial concepts thinking that the race of giants would be a featured part of their original plan for a montage-driven cinematic opening to the Wrath of the Lich King. The game design team later came up with a different design and the Vrykul were dropped from the cinematic, but obviously Vrykul Scourge still exists. Here's more of them. That thing is wicked looking. It's like a crazy claw, and then dual wielding still again. Gross. This would be his face. Someone's taking a bite out of his head. More sketches. Undead Orc Study and Undead Tauren Study. So that would be an Undead Orc. This would be a Scourge Tauren. And Scourge Rampant. Just running. Wah. This one's Elven, kind of. Maybe Worgen. Even though Worgen didn't quite exist yet. Here's the nice color picture. And from the background, I think this is maybe going to set us up with an inlay. Yeah, so these are just, that's what they said, the color studies were coming. Here's an Abomination with multiple arms standing amidst the Scourge. That's a pretty dope picture. And here are Scourge Shield Studies. I like how they've got this mirror frost-like quality. It's pretty cool how they combine those two. Oh, holding a head of a Draenei. Gnome Death Study. Oh, it's a gnome head. Oh. And he looks like a human Scourge with some, and then here's some weapons, some spears, various Scourge weapon studies. And I like how they have the runes that make it like in the same family as Frostmourne. Giant maces and axes, everything spiky, jagged, some rune color. This is a black piece, which means we're starting the next page, which is chapter 3, starting the next chapter, Raising the Dragon. Okay, so here is the picture of him standing atop Sindragosa, the Dreaming. Some said that Arthas was still in control of his own actions when he ascended the steps of the Frozen Throne. Others claim that he had been the Lich King's creature ever since taking up Frostmourne. Whatever the case, a single voice stood out in the Death Knight's mind as he reached the runic armor encased in ice. "Return the blade," commanded the Lich King. "Complete the circle. Release me from this prison." With a roar, Arthas brought Frostmourne down, shattering the frozen throne. He then donned Ner'zhul's helm, sealing his union with the Lich King. The Lich King then resumed his place upon the throne, and there he sat in quiet meditation. The part of the Lich King that was Arthas began to reflect on the events of his life, on the path that had taken him so far from the young boy who had been his father's pride and joy, which I guess explains why so much time elapses between all of that happening and the start of the actual expansion. In the midst of his reflections, Arthas sensed a bitter and ancient presence locked within the nearby ice, and with this realization came a single name: Sindragosa, the Forge. The crafters, the masons, the smiths, call them what you will, these are the souls who are tasked with bringing Arthas, Sindragosa, and Frostmourne to life. At Blizzard, there is a skilled team of production artists that fall into a few main groups. Modelers, tech, including rigging, simming, tools, and research and development. Animators and finishers, including matte painting, lighting effects, and compositing. Firing the Forge. Once the pre-production work is finished, everyone on the production team hits the ground running. The modelers reference concept art to design their meshes. The animators begin shooting reference videos to think through how the different characters will move. And the tech team begins to figure out the basic rigging structures, what sorts of simulations will be needed, and to develop any tools the other teams will need to complete the project. Meanwhile, finishing begins research and development on lighting, effects, and the general setup of the scenes. While these different teams all begin working at the same time, BFD has organized them into a coherent, fairly linear pipeline that moves production through different distinct phases of development, while also providing the flexibility needed for true collaboration and feedback between departments. The modelers create and surface the digital frame of the characters and the environments. The tech team engineers the infrastructure needed to make the models move and interact with everything in the digital environment, while also developing tools for the rest of the teams. The animators bring the models to life by orchestrating their movements, and the finishers polish everything by adding lighting and special effects and then compositing the final shots. Modeling. Modelers begin by making simple mesh forms for each of the main characters, i.e. the Lich King, Sindragosa, the key figures in the Scourge army. These meshes were pushed through a series of tests to assure that they would work within their design parameters of the environment that would be created around them. After the simple models pass the testing phase, the modelers proceed to res them up, adding... Nowadays, you might say, riz them up, adding layers of detail to these basic physical features. They make the meshes more elaborate by adding more polygons, and then begin to add surface details, creating maps of various textures, patterns, and light refractions that further characterize the model. During this process, they draw on concept art for inspiration and guidance. Rigging. Once the model mesh has been made more elaborate, the model goes over to the tech team for rigging. Rigging, by definition, is the process by which a skeletal structure is engineered for the model and controls for the various joints are added. The Lich King's face rig alone has scores of controls, as does his armor. When the animators begin to pose the models for each frame, the range of possible motions is dictated by how the model was rigged, i.e. how many points of articulation the model has. Think of it as the model's respective joints, muscles, and tendons. That's why it takes so long to make like a 3-minute CGI. Animation. Once the rigging has been set and the synoptic interface for controlling it has been designed by the tech team's R&D branch, the model and rig are passed off to animation. The animators walk the models through 3 main phases of animation. In the first pass, they lay out the key movements and proportions for the scene. The second pass is where most of the work is done. During this phase, the animators block out the main movements of a character and create a mostly finished sequence that includes the most significant actions the character will take. The third pass finishes the performance by adding more subtle intricacies to the performance, such as facial gestures. During the second phase of the animation process for the Wrath of the Lich King cinematic, the BFD animators shot their own reference material with a video camera in the parking lot on the Blizzard campus, mimicking some of the key gestures made by the Lich King and the Undead in order to better replicate realistic physical movement during animation. When the animation team reviewed this footage alongside the final character designs submitted by the modelers, though, they had some concerns. This is on the right, a dragon hatchling. All of the subtleties of motion the animators hoped to capture and reference for the Lich King's animation, e.g. bringing their swords up high over their heads and then slamming them down into the ground, simply wouldn't work because the Lich King has huge spiky pauldrons. The desired animation in this case would have ended up having the hero decapitate himself. As he raised the sword, his shoulders would have collapsed into each other and crushed his head. Undaunted, the animators went out and purchased football shoulder pads and a wool blanket to use as a restrictive and heavy cape like the one the Lich King wears. Fully armed and dangerous, they reshot their reference videos with much better success, keeping in mind what sorts of motions the Lich King could realistically make when fully girded. Simulations. While the attention animators pay to their characters' movements can become extremely detailed during the third pass in the animation process, there are also some highly detailed movements and intricate character features that animators can't animate due to time constraints, e.g., all bits of bone and sinew that make up Sindragos's body. These items require simulations that are devised by the technical department. As opposed to having an animator move each constituent part in each frame for these complex features, these parts are programmed to have qualities such as resistance, density, etc., that allow the different forces at play in the physical environment, such as gravity or wind, to affect their movements according to complex algorithms devised by the tech team. That's actually super cool. For the Wrath of the Lich King cinematic, the Simmers had to program the Lich King's hair, cloak, fur-lined gloves, boots, as well as layers of environmental effects such as snow. In one scene, for example, the Lich King strikes a heroic pose in which he rears up, revealing his pauldrons in all their skull and spike-laden glory. This movement simply demanded that the environment respond in kind. The tech team started throwing wind at him and billowing snow around him. When they turned the character around, the area where the cloth of the cape was supposed to hang down his back wasn't looking right. The shoulder pads had completely collapsed into each other. Many iterations were needed to strike the right balance between the forces of gravity and wind and the stiffness of the cape, so that the simmed movements would appear realistic and properly balanced in a 3D physical environment, while still preserving what was aesthetically warranted for the character. That's pretty cool. Finishing. The finishers are the ones who compile all the different production elements that go into a finished scene. This includes lighting, rendering, and effects work, as well as those special touches that really complete a scene and add an extra degree of quality and drama, such as the environmental details that surround the main characters and camera tracking. Lighting a scene in a CG cinematic is not merely a question of setting up key, fill, and reflective lights, but also involves embellishing the frame with layers of shading and lighting effects. Early on, the lighting team receives very rough versions of animated scenes with the details blocked out. Using these scenes, they work through the lighting options as if they were working with final scenes. When the final scenes begin cycling through, the finishers migrate these rough effects to the fully produced scenes and refine them, bringing those scenes to completion more efficiently. One of the first things the FX team did for the Wrath of the Lich King cinematic was to prepare the varieties of snow they knew would be featured in the final cut. Northrend is a harsh place with tons of snow, falling snow, blowing snow, snow that sticks to fur, and snow flurries. For the finishers, modelers, and tech team, each of these types of snow was a separate environmental visual effect that had to be developed. Down the line, when the animation team handed off their scenes to the finishers, the snow effects they had to work with were already close to being complete. Once the final shots are composited and then passed through final rendering and review, the cinematic is complete. The Wrath of the Lich King is ready to be unleashed on an unsuspecting world. Watch, tremble, and prepare to confront the challenges that wait in the frozen continent of Northrend. I think when this book is done, I'm not going to do it on this show because we'll do it later, but I think you owe it to yourself, and maybe I'll do it on my own off camera to watch this cinematic. Here we have Sindragosa modeling geometry details and Sindragosa color study. That's the color study right there. Modeling. Modeling is the process by which the 3D body of a character in a cinematic is fashioned. It begins by first assembling a general grouping of polygons, or low poly, that will form the basis of the figure. This framework is known as a mesh. A typical gameplay character mesh in World of Warcraft contains a few hundred polys. In contrast, cinematic figures have millions. Although final cinematic models are incredibly complex, BFD uses low poly figures to test basic movements. Beginning with a low poly figure, modelers refine the character, gradually making the mesh more complex by adding more and more polygons and adjusting the ones that have already been incorporated into the figure. As they near the final model for a character, they drop these meshes onto the second pass animations, which have been developed up to that point with the low poly meshes, which they'll cover in like 10 pages. In the cinematic for Wrath of the Lich King, BFD knew that the undead dragon Sindragosa would present a special challenge for modeling, rigging, and animation due to the complexity of her design. To create her character, they started with a basic layer for her skeleton. Once they had perfected that, they added additional layers to fill out the meat, tendons, and wing skin that hang off her frame, referencing the final concept drawing, which I guess they did a while ago, 30 pages prior. This is the, what was that called? A modeling geometry. I don't know how that doesn't look very geometry to me. This is a Scourge Warrior surfacing. Okay, the Scourge had head surfaces bump, diffuse, displace, subsurface. And the Scourge head surface reflection. Surfacing. Modeling gets extremely complex and forms the basis of a character's design, but most of the details we appreciate in a character or object are most likely the product of a subset of modeling called surfacing. Surfacing is essentially the process of layering on maps of graphic detail, such as skin tone, textures, etc., onto a model. In a Blizzard cinematic, a typical character will have dozens of maps. 6 of the most commonly used surfaces on a model are: 1. Diffuse. A diffuse surface is one that applies a base color to an object. Kind of like a primer. 2 is subsurface. A subsurface map adds color to a mesh as well, but instead of describing the effect of direct light bouncing off a solid object, it portrays the effect of light passing through an object. For example, when light passes through the layer of skin that forms the span of a dragon's wing. 3. Displacement. A displacement or displaced surface is a texture that is applied to a model that creates slight deformations affecting the silhouette of an object. An example would be the warty skin of a toad or pockmarked flesh of a zombie. 4. Bump. A bump surface is really a subset of displacement. It is a slight texture or irregularity in the surface that doesn't influence the silhouette of an object. So you can kind of see right here where they've got some of that versus that. 5. Specularity. Specularity surfaces depict the shiny and wet spots on a surface and the particular reflections and refractions of light that these features cause. I don't see any specularity listed as part of these. 6. Reflection. The reflection surface depicts how much light bounces off a surface. Oh, here we have this one. It says to the right here. This is the reflection one. So it's kind of showing as they explode it out, the light reflecting off of all these different skin pieces. The Lich King rigging. So you can kind of see, I guess, the polys and Sindragosa rigging diagram. So you're really just seeing like core. Yeah, it's very polygonal. It's almost like axes that they're setting up the imaging on. Whereas look at her rigging is all over each articulating point, basically. Rigging is basically the skeleton and joints of a character, the interior structure and pivot points that determine how it moves. Animators use a character's rigging to design movements for the character. And they're going to, I guess, cover that in a few pages. Typically, animators move a character by manipulating a user interface that assigns a button to each pivot or point of articulation in the rigging, much like a joint, rather than adjusting the actual rig. Once preliminary rigging is complete, riggers submit their designs to a series of basic range of motion tests before handing the rigging characters off to the animation team. In the case of the Lich King's rigging, for example, preliminary tests showed that his shoulder pads as designed in the concept phase would be a serious problem for the type of actions BFD initially had planned for him, namely raising Frostmourne dramatically over his head to plunge into the ice. On first pass, the Lich King's shoulders collapsed into the mesh for his neck, making it look like the spikes and blades of his massive pauldrons were decapitating him when he raised his sword. You still see a lot of that with these low poly in-game cinematics. Stuff like that happens all the time. They then had to hand the character back to the concept artist to rework its dimensions. The riggers then limited the Lich King's range of motion by adding binding points that restrict his movements as soon as his shoulder pads get too close to his neck. These points define a range of motion for the character that is realistic given the physical constraints of his armor. Sindragosa, too, was a challenge for riggers on the Wrath of the Lich King cinematic, in the sense that she had more limbs than the humanoid characters they typically work with. More limbs, of course, means more pivots. Her exposed interiors and various bits of flesh and tendon inspired debate about how to rig her, too. It wasn't clear at first whether or not they should rig all the meaty bits so that animators could move them individually by hand. While this strategy would have offered maximum control, it also would have created an incredible workload for animators. Production ultimately decided that it would be best to defer these movements to the simulation team. Sindragosa's fleshy bits are moved by computer simulation, then in accordance with the forces, e.g. gravity, wind, etc., and the tech team applied to the respective scenes. So basically, that you have these articulation points that the animators can control, but all of this other stuff is just dealt with by the forces of gravity and all that, the programs, basically, the algorithms. Research and development. R&D really shone through the production of the Wrath of the Lich King cinematic when confronted with a particular challenge, populating the Scourge army. At first, production assumed that it would have to design and render the thousands of figures involved individually. This presented a huge problem that promised to consume hundreds of hours of setup time and massive computer resources. R&D devised a plan that allowed production to reduce the level of detail and number of calculations needed. To begin, they started with 3 different basic meshes of varying detail, which had been designed by the modeling team. So that's these guys right here. These 3 figures were assigned respective distances from the camera, with the more detailed model in the foreground and the least detailed in the back, much like we would see them in real life with the naked eye. Modelers next designed a number of helmets, chest plates, weapons, and shields that could be used to arm these warriors. The tech team then randomized the distribution of these elements among the warriors. The result was an instant army. I guess you see that here. They're all standing arms out. This meant that production did not have to have their computers calculate a high level of detail for every single one of the undead warriors included in the shot, making it a much more manageable scene to work with. And so, like, if you really zoom in, you can see the replication happening in some of these spots. But yeah, otherwise it's insane. The Scourge level of detail study and Scourge test population in the final Scourge army, or when we get these different pieces. Lich King animation frames and the Scourge army animation. Animation is the process by which a character is brought to life. The animators working on a cinematic are the actors in a way. They design and orchestrate the demeanor and body language of a character, giving it a sense of being and personality through poses and posture. For example, Lich King is a very stiff character, always ready for battle. This ready stance is one of his defining characteristics and one that adds menace to his appearance. Whenever the Lich King breaks this upright posture, he suddenly looks less threatening. For most of the cinematic, then, the animators made sure to keep him rigid. The consistency was a particular problem, though, when it came to the moment in the cinematic when the Lich King rises from a kneeling posture after plunging his sword into the ground and awakening Sindragosa. In the first test runs for the sequence, the Lich King would rise like any other person, bending over with his back visible and bringing his head up last. To avoid this vulnerable opening, the team used a unique posture for him in which he ascends with his chest jutting out and his arms in front, facing the camera and lifting his head to attention from the start, echoing the Lich King's persistent ready stance when standing. This movement preserved the sense of menace and invulnerability that surrounds the character throughout. Like traditional cell animators who work by hand, CG animators will draft and set a series of keyframes and then fill in the frames between them through a more automated process. Traditional animators would defer this fill-in work to a host of artists working under them. In the case of CG animation, this populating of the gaps between keyframes is done by a computer. Because of the complexity of their characters and animations, BFD sets keyframes for each limb using the interface for the rigging of the character devised by the tech team. This allows them to quickly pose and move different limbs on each character. Okay, you kind of see that stance. It's kind of cheesy, but see what they're doing. Here are these studies that they talked about, these frame by frame as they look up. And these are actually not drawn. These are created CGI. And I guess you can see more and more. They're the same thing, but it looks like they have different layers added onto them. Slightly different hues to them. Okay, so we'll go a little further, but we're kind of getting time here. Matte painting. Up until recently, Blizzard had always produced everything in their movie sequences in full 3D, including the far backgrounds that reach all the way to the horizon line. This technique allowed the team to light anything dynamically at any point in the scene, ensuring that the complete graphic package never veered from the studio's established visual style. But modeling and animating everything seen in a cinematic shot is simply too time-consuming and costly to accomplish on an opening basis. Projecting matte paintings over low-resolution background meshes of landscape features in the shape of mountains, cliffs, glaciers, and rocks to establish the far background of a scene saves time and production resources, while also creating great-looking environments. It also allows BFD to expand the scope of the environments represented in their cinematics, which was crucial in the case of Wrath of the Lich King cinematic with its vast snowscapes. Matte painters can typically paint from photo references, but BFD mattes have to be drafted in such a way that they can conform to the unique visual style of World of Warcraft, which doesn't necessarily obey all the laws of reality and uses color palettes that aren't photorealistic. Creatively, Blizzard likes the saturated, vivid, and contrasting colors that help define the pushed epic vision of World of Warcraft. To stay within the realm of Blizzard's distinct visual style, then, the BFD matte painters flirt with reality, crafting background environments that showcase a high level of detail, but that are saturated with bright colors and put through the Blizzard lens. The end result looks halfway between painting and computer graphics, in keeping with World of Warcraft's unique visual style. Once the look of a matte has been established by the artists, the production team migrates the art into the 3D environment, projecting it onto a poly mesh of the landscape with multiple layers of matte painting in place. They can even bend the perspective on the background, making the matte a dynamic part of the shot that supports the actions of the characters in the foreground. Gradually, the environment mesh is enhanced and the matte painting is refined as the other background and midground planes of the scene are blocked out and integrated into the overall picture. Kind of see what it looks like there. Low poly matte painting model geometry here, and Dragon Hill matte paintings. That actually looks awesome right there. Yeah, you can see it. It does actually look really good. And here's how they push it into the background, and it really is just like a painting. It's all thrown on top of. It's pretty cool. Okay, well, composition. When storyboarding, storyboard artists block out the basic elements in a shot and often hit upon the main compositional features, where everything is to be placed in the shot, how the different elements will relate to one another, and how they will be framed in the overall picture. But final compositions are not always decided at the storyboarding stage, as storyboard artists are primarily concerned with nailing down content, or the series of events that are going to make up a story. Down the line, when the project moves into production, if individual shot concepts require further revision or reconceptualization, the director will require more elaborate composition studies. This happened during the Wrath of the Lich King cinematics development in the case of two particularly dramatic moments. When Sindragos's claw breaks through the ice, which is what we're seeing here, and when the frostworm rears up on a promontory above the undead army coming up. Sometimes the director will request these additional studies because he has a clear idea of how he wants to organize the shot or depict the character using a certain angle or lighting effect, and wants to pre-visualize the concept. In other cases, the request is made because it's less certain how the team should proceed. In these latter cases, these studies provide an opportunity to decide on the details and come to a collective understanding about how the final image should look when fully orchestrated. So we have Sindragos's Awakening composition study, Dragon Hill composition studies, and then coming up, Dragon Hill color and lighting studies. The bottom left image on page 138, which is a few pages away, is the one BFD selected as a reference piece for color and lighting in production. So here we have these kind of, I guess, additional storyboards they've done for the graphic portion themselves. Here's the color added on there. It's a blurry picture on my part, my bad. Get ready for a lot of those on the next book, my photography was crappy. Look, that one I did good. That was nice and clear. But yeah, these are just basically paintings. They look awesome. Anyone would, I mean, anybody that has like the original copies of these, they could auction these off. They could give them away as fan things. These are great. I'd put them on my walls for sure. Yeah, so this is just going to continue going on and on. Apparently, what we're in the middle of here is a dense lesson. We're taking a class right now in what it's like to make a CGI. So this is very, very technical episode. So if you're into that, I think it's kind of cool. The art itself is cool to look at, but I'm actually, part of me is sort of kind of nerding out over it, and I think it's pretty neat. So hopefully you are too, and if not, just skip this one. Oh, it's too late. You probably already did. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. Another episode in the Pipe 5x5, and I will see you next time on Lore of Warcraft.